It's a really deep question. You could go into so many things. I think a big thing is consumerism.
I think it means something different to so many different people.
I actually question, what does sustainability even mean? And I feel like it just gets more and more complicated as the industry expands.
From a maker point of view, it's not really that difficult to wait and spend a little bit more on fabrics that are ethically produced.
A lot of people think that sustainable fashion is all about buying organic clothes or things that are really expensive.
I'll hold my hands up, sustainability and ethically made clothing is more expensive.
Go in your wardrobe, what can you do with that? Can you donate it?
You know, the full life cycle of the garment has been evaluated and is done in the most ecological friendly way for our planet.
Materials, if you can't afford some fancy GOTS certified cotton, go to a charity shop, use old clothes.
You know, is it going to live for 5 years? What's going to happen afterwards? Will it biodegrade? Will it not? Does it need composting?
And if you're working with other people, if you can't be paying them fairly, then you shouldn't be running a business, is my personal point of view.
It's because the workers actually getting paid the amount they should be paid.
Being slow is a key part of that. You know, it takes time to grow materials, it takes time to sew them and produce garments.
I would never want to buy something really cheap if I know someone suffered because of it.
So there's like a very much an emotional value to sustainable fashion.
I mean, I probably spend less on clothes than your average person, and I'm, you know, obsessed with clothes in a way. So I think it is definitely a question of scale. You know, we don't need to be producing as much. I think sometimes when we have so much choice, we don't really know where to go, or, you know, we get overwhelmed. So we just think, right, well, we'll buy one in each colour, you know, and I think just every single approach to fashion, you know, does need to change.
There is a market for cheap fashion because a lot of people, especially with the current climate, cost of living crisis, people are not going to want to spend £50 on a jumper that is possibly ethically made or more when there's one at Primark for 15 quid that does the same thing, is a similar colour. You know, I do understand the demographic that goes to those places, and it's not always a bad demographic. Some people do it out of necessity.
You know, when people are struggling to, you know, just get by day to day, or maybe have to work multiple jobs just to kind of like pay rent and afford bills, you know, sustainable fashion isn't a priority. You can't expect someone to care about the planet when they're struggling to make ends meet or feed their kids. Like,
especially as someone who is not straight sized, charity shops can be an issue for bigger people like myself, and sometimes Primark and places like that do become the only option. And so I am not trying to guilt anyone into saying never shop at all, even if you're absolutely desperate to need it. If you use that item for a long time, you're being sustainable.
They're ripping off people that don't have a voice in the system. So they're ripping off the farmers, they're ripping off the garment factory workers, they're ripping off the middlemen who are, you know, transporting the goods. They do everything on such a mass scale that makes it cheaper anyway.
I mean, every product you ever create, whether it's, you know, clothes or whether it's a dog lead, whether it's a water bottle, anything has got different aspects to it. You've got the actual parts needed to create it, you've got your labor time to make it, and then you've got to think, okay, I need a profit margin on this. Everyone has to do that, and that is totally acceptable, that's fine. But when you think that Primark are making profit off £2.50 shirts, that shows how little that the labour is getting and how little they're paying for the fabric.
But mostly it's greed. People at the top, they want to make as much money as they can, so they produce as cheaply as possible, outsourcing to countries where, or even like we saw not that long ago, it was in Luton, wasn't it? There was a sweatshop set up where people are so desperate for any kind of money that they're happy to be paid next to nothing, because feeding themselves is more important than having a well-paying job. And unfortunately, it's the world we live in, where a lot of people at the top of the chain are going to take advantage because they don't see these people, and they don't see it, they don't care. It's money in their pocket at the end of the day, that's all they see, the numbers.
I think the entire industry needs to change. I mean, it's so far removed from the word fashion. I say this all the time in every single discussion that I ever have about fashion, that the word fashion itself means to create. Well, we've created a monster with the fashion industry. It is, it's either elite or it's either completely, exploiting people all around the world. So I think the entire industry needs to change. There is no reason why we need to be making so many billions of pairs of jeans every single year, or why we are shipping 900 million items off to Kenya because we don't want them anymore.
Maybe we don't shop at H&M, we shop slightly higher up, but we have one piece that lasts for ages, and it's more socially acceptable to only have that one really good piece. Then that would cause a change. But then also, if we had the top brands coming from the coming from there and being like, no, we're only going to produce a certain amount, we can then find a middle ground where it does then become more sustainable to shop at those places. But I think that's a long way from happening, and I think there's too many other factors, both economic, political, and all sorts of other things that would prevent that from happening. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of stuff going on and there's a lot of progress being made. I 100% recognize that, and I think it's really good. I just don't think any of it's happening fast enough. And I think that's because corporations, the only reason I can really see is because they don't want to, risk the bottom line. It's too hard almost to change. And I think, that's a terrifying fact, but also quite an exciting one, because, as young designers, we can do all sorts of cool stuff to force those changes and to make different changes and to, educate people, as I was saying, and talk more about it. And if we can encourage consumers to shop in different ways and inspire them to have different values and show a different way of existing within fashion, then I think that's really exciting and a really, really cool opportunity, which we're kind of on a tipping point. So I think, addressing fashion sustainability issues, its impact on the earth, is the biggest issue in fashion right now. But if they moved over to a more sustainable practice, they would actually be able to last the next 10 years, and we would have a planet to live on for the next 10 years, which could be relatively healthy, instead of contributing to climate change. Fashion is the second or third biggest polluter in the world after oil. It produces 8 to 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions. I don't feel people are addressing this.
A lot of Asian cultures that have a lot of the manufacturing for clothing, places like India, Bangladesh, all these sorts of places, the work culture there is very different. If you're injured or you're sick, it's not quite like over here. 90% of the time it's like, okay, well, you can't work then, I don't need you, I'll get someone else. So people are then put in a place where they're unemployed. So this one company that I found that sold this fabric take those unemployed people, whether it's through sickness or disability or having to leave to care for family, they take those people, they give them short working hours, and they hand loom this fabric, and they're paid ethically, they're paid to survive, basically, they're paid to actually live. It's so much better. And I found this fabric and I was like, I'm in love with this fabric, not only because it looks gorgeous and it's a beautiful color and it's sustainable fabrics, but it's actually helping people.
I've been working with Friends of the Earth Cymru and a few other organisations for the last couple of years, and we've set up a task force, the Sustainable Clothing Textiles Cymru, and we've started to work alongside the Welsh Government and RAP as well to sort of find ways to implement change within the government, because Wales is such a leading country when it comes to circularity and recycling and environmental awareness, but very little is actually happening with our clothes.
I think governments all over the world need to start implementing stricter regulations around fashion.
And again, going back to education, I think that's, crucial.
And I think part of the reason I've got into this industry is because I was creative as a kid. I had sewing lessons in school and they had sewing clubs, and you would go in and you'd make little things and you'd learn how to sew a button on and you'd learn how to patch up a rip.
I think that if it's embedded within education and schools with the support of the government, then I think that's one way of definitely trying to tackle the problem.
Because so many people would rather buy a new button-up shirt because a button's fallen off than sew it back on.
How they would, exactly overcome this overnight, I think it's something that would take, a very, very long time to implement changes. It is such a common thing that people don't realize how much power they have. But, one person thinking that could be one of, a million people that are also thinking that at the same time. What can I do as an individual to change? And I really like the story of how Fashion Revolution started. So that was to mark the Rana Plaza collapse, which happened 10 years ago, next month actually. And it all started with one woman, Carrie Summers, who decided that she was going to set up an organisation to make sure that these kind of industrial disasters never happen again. And now, Fashion Revolution is a global campaign. Started with one individual. I remember before she'd even set it up, having a coffee with her in London and just thinking, wow, she's, got these really crazy, ambitious plans. 10 years later, they've got like hundreds of thousands of followers on Instagram. They have events all around the world in almost every single country. And you just think, well, that was one person that came up with that crazy idea to start Fashion Revolution. And, it's something that I support every year. Every single school or college that I know of, they do Fashion Revolution activities, and it just goes to show that one person can make a huge difference.
Just sometimes if you think about it a bit more, you're helping yourself out in a selfish sense. I think a lot of consumerism is these days. People are like, oh, well, it's not going to benefit me, and I'm like, well, in the end, it will, because the planet won't be burning as fast. You're not going to have as much damage from the fibers and stuff that are being used. You're not going to be, putting children at risk. A lot of people need that sort of, dare I say, narcissistic convincing to think about things, especially with throwaway culture and the people who buy into that. But, just to think about things a bit more isn't damaging. It can do you a lot of good.
Greenwashing is one of the big issues. It was a couple, maybe last week, Primark came out saying they're doing a take back initiative now, which is great, and they are making steps towards being sustainable. But all these fast fashion brands that are producing tens of thousands of pieces of clothing a season are able to slap terms like sustainable and green on their products because they did one part of it sustainably. For example, they used recycled fabric. That doesn't mean the whole process is sustainable or ethical, but all these fast fashion brands that are producing tens of thousands of pieces of clothing a season are able to slap terms like sustainable and green on their products because they did one part of it sustainably. For example, they used recycled fabric. That doesn't mean the whole process is sustainable or ethical, but because they've done that, they're allowed to say, look at this, we're amazing, we're doing green fashion. So one big thing that needs to change is there needs to be actual regulations in place for who in the fashion industry is allowed to use certain terms and tell consumers that this is a good ethical product. But if there were regulations in place through the government, for example, and Primark isn't allowed to use the term sustainable until they meet a clear set of goals set out by the government that everyone can access easily, then it would just be a lot easier for people to be aware of what is actually sustainable fashion.
Educating yourself, gaining knowledge on it, sort of thinking, okay, I am going to read about sustainability, I am going to read about this, that and the other. There's so many articles out there, there's so many books out there about sustainability. There's so much out there that you can do. I think as well, your approach to shopping, look in your wardrobe, look at what you've got. Do you need anything? And say, okay, if I need something, I need to make sure it can work with X amount of outfits. I'm going to get X amount of wear out of it.
So push for these changes from the government and the companies that you buy from. Let the companies know that you're not going to buy from them unless you see real proof that they are a sustainable brand. You want them to release how much they're paying people. You just let them know by not buying.
Look at renting. I'm going to a couple of weddings later this summer, and they've all want to have big hats. I don't want to buy a big hat. I don't have the space for a big hat. I don't need a big hat. So I'm renting a big hat. Buy secondhand when you can, because so much secondhand stuff is really, really good quality and the same price as new stuff. And it's got a nice story behind it usually. And just think before you spend.
I think a lot of the time the responsibility is placed on the consumers, and that does put a lot of pressure on people. But if we start shouting loud enough, then people will start to have to listen.
So I'm currently working on a jacket using all the fabrics I've got laying around. There's that I'm working on literally right now, so it's a bit of a creative mess. I've got all my threads either side of me. So I'm on Instagram at the minute. I'm Wintle Designs.
I'm exploring how we can bring we can make biological materials, we can bring bacteria, mycelium, algae into living systems. I'm a biodesigner, I'm a fashion designer, I'm interdisciplinary, you could say. I'm on Instagram and TikTok under the handle Lewandowska.
So if anybody, ever wants to reach out and find out more, I'm happy for people to contact me. You can either head across to the Fashion Wales website, which is fashionwales.org. On there, you'll find a load of different resources, whether you're a consumer looking for a different brand, maybe you're, hoping to join a sewing class or fashion course. There's lots and lots of different listings on the website. For educators out there, we've also got an area dedicated to where you've got some free downloadable resources that you can use in your own classroom.
My business is called Bombus Artisanal. It's that's the Latin term for bees, because I'm a little bit obsessed with bees, so I made it my whole branding, because why not? If you're a maker or you're interested in checking me out, I'm bombus.artisanal on Instagram.